My name is Teresa Lane. I am 62 years old, a retired bakery owner, and a widow. For most of my life, I believed my purpose was simple: to hold my family together no matter what it cost me. I gave my best years, my health, my savings, and my heart to my husband and my son. After Samuel passed away, I poured what was left of my energy into making sure our only child, Michael, never felt alone in the world. Maybe that was my first mistake. This afternoon, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, scattering across the polished wood floors like it always did around this hour. The Hudson River shimmered in the distance, quiet and steady, like a promise that had never been broken. I was standing in the kitchen, a pot of Earl Grey steaming gently beside me, when Michael walked in with his wife Emily. They did not look like guests. They looked like people with an agenda. Michael's jaw was tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, a habit he had when bracing himself to say something unpleasant. Emily stayed half a step behind him, her eyes darting around the room as if she were already memorizing what would soon belong to her family. He did not waste time. "Mom," he said, his tone flat but sharp, "the penthouse is theirs now, Emily's parents. They need it more than you. You're banned from coming back." The words sliced through the air with surgical precision. No hesitation, no remorse. For a moment, the only sound was the faint clink of my teaspoon against the china cup as I set it down. I felt the heat of the tea against my fingertips, but the rest of my body was cold. The kind of cold that starts deep in your chest and spreads outward until it reaches your skin. I looked at my son, the boy I had carried, nursed, and raised, the man I had celebrated with when he got his first job, the same man who had cried in my arms when his father died, and now he was looking at me as if I were an obstacle in his way. I thought about the tagline that would perfectly sum up this moment if someone were telling my story. My son took my penthouse for his wife's family. He said, "It's theirs now, you're banned." I smiled and handed him the keys. What I didn't tell him was that I had already made my decision about this place long before he walked in today. But he didn't need to know that yet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key ring, the same one Samuel had given me the day we closed on this penthouse. The metal was warm from my palm, the edges worn smooth over the years. I walked past Michael, the keys dangling between my fingers, and set them gently on the marble countertop. The sound was small, almost polite, but it landed like a stone in the silence. "If you think that's what's right," I said softly, my voice steady, "then that's what it will be." He blinked, clearly not expecting me to agree so quickly. He had probably prepared himself for a fight, rehearsed arguments about how I barely stayed here, how Emily's parents were struggling, how I was being unreasonable. Instead, I had given him nothing to push against. Emily's lips curled into something between a smirk and relief. Michael, however, shifted his weight uncomfortably. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it passed quickly. He reached for the keys without another word. Inside, my thoughts were not silent. They were measured, deliberate, and sharper than they had been in years. The smell of Earl Grey still hung in the air, the faint citrus and bergamot a strange comfort against the sour taste rising in my throat. My heart beat in a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost matching the tick of the clock on the far wall. I could feel every detail in the room, the cool smoothness of the countertop under my hand, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the muted roar of the city 20 floors below. I studied my son's face as he pocketed the keys. There was no recognition there, no flicker of the boy who used to draw me crayon pictures of our dream house. This man was practical, decisive, and, right now, merciless. Perhaps life had taught him to be that way, or perhaps I had, by always giving in. Emily cleared her throat. "We'll have our things moved in by next weekend," she said, her tone brisk, as if she were talking to a realtor instead of the woman whose home she was taking. It's for the best. For the best. I had heard those words before, in different forms, from people who wanted something they had no right to take. I did not argue then, and I would not argue now. That was the difference between people like them and people like me. They believed silence meant defeat. I knew silence could be a weapon. I nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. I see, I said, letting the words hang just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then I stepped aside, giving them the path to the door. Michael hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but Emily's hand on his arm steered him toward the elevator. The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt louder than it should. I stood alone in the quiet, my gaze drifting to the river outside. The water was calm, but I knew what lay beneath, currents that could pull you under before you realized you were in trouble. My fingers traced the edge of the countertop where the keys had rested. My mind was already turning over the next steps, the same way I used to plan the layers of a wedding cake, patiently, precisely, with an eye for the final picture. I had been preparing for this day, though not in the way Michael imagined. I knew my son well enough to see the path he was walking. Years of small requests had led to bigger ones. Years of me saying yes had taught him that no was a foreign language I could not speak, but I could speak it. I just chose my moment. If he thought today was the end of my place in this home, he was wrong. If he thought I would walk away empty-handed, he was even more wrong. The sun shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor. I poured the rest of my tea into the sink, rinsed the cup, and set it upside down to dry. My movements were slow, deliberate, the way one moves when they know they are not rushing to catch up. They are waiting for the right time to begin. If you think that's what's right, I whispered again, the words tasting different now, then that's what it will be. Only this time I knew the truth. It would not be his truth. It would be mine. And as the clock ticked on in the quiet of my kitchen, I could almost hear Samuel's voice in my head, steady and certain. You were never as powerless as you thought, Teresa. I dried my hands on the linen towel hanging by the sink, the one embroidered with our initials. Then I looked toward the door, where they had left minutes ago, and allowed myself the smallest of smiles. I had given them the keys. I had not given them the home. I did not move after the door closed. The space felt wider, as if silence had pushed the walls apart. The steam from the kettle lifted into the afternoon light and vanished, and the room shifted back to a different rain. I can still name the color of that evening. The sky was the graphite of a soft pencil. The Hudson ran with broken silver. The city lowered its voice. I unfolded the white tablecloth my mother embroidered when she was young. Tiny wheat stalks traced the hem like patient handwriting. The linen carried a faint lavender scent from the drawer where I keep it waiting for company. I smoothed it flat with the flat of my hands and heard the stove answer. In the cast iron, beef stew sat heavy and kind. Onions melted toward sweetness. Carrots surrendered at the edge of the fork. Pepper woke the air. I put a record on. The saxophone did not hurry. It climbed and circled and made room for quiet the way a good host makes room for a late guest. Michael called from the elevator and I did not let him knock. I opened the door and rain came with him. He shook his head and laughed, water bright on his hair and jaw. For 1 second, he was 9 again, guilty about strawberries gone missing from a cooling tray. He said he was starving. He said his apartment smelled like reheated noodles and ambition. He said he had forgotten what dinner tasted like when someone cooked it on purpose. I took his coat and set it near the radiator. We ate by the window because the city is better company when it rains. Puddles stretched the streetlights into ribbons of gold, and the river drew a dark, steady line across the world. He lifted his spoon and closed his eyes. His shoulders fell the way a fist unlearns itself. He began to talk between mouthfuls, the way hungry men remember they are allowed to be boys at a table that loves them. Long shifts, a manager who brewed coffee like medicine, a schedule that kept moving the finish line, I kept his bowl full. I wanted the steadiness of the meal to argue with the rest of his life. When he asked about the penthouse, I told him I had bought it 2 months after his father died. I wanted a place where mourning did not feel like an exam. The balcony faced east. A chair at the rail meant I could practice breathing without an audience. He stood and walked to the glass. He pressed his palm to the window as if the river might answer him. He turned and said a sentence that has lived in me ever since. Home is where love stays. He did not drop it like a proverb. He lifted it like a discovery. He looked at the stew and the linen and the river and me, and I believed him. I told him he could come whenever he wanted. He reached across the table and held my fingers with the same quiet strength he used as a boy when the hallway seemed too long. After dinner, I brought out the family album. The leather was cracked at the corners from years of thumbs. We sat shoulder to shoulder and turned the pages. Samuel in the bakery, flour pale on his cheek, Michael on a milk crate, piping frosting across a cake that read, "Happy with 1 pea too many," because he refused to stop. My mother by a line of sunlit sheets, the same tablecloth pegged and waving like a small flag. We did not narrate much. The saxophone made space for the softness that could not be spoken without shrinking. When he left, he kissed my temple and promised Saturday. I watched the elevator numbers count down and thought, rituals hold. Love leaves crumbs like a trail. People meant to return know how to follow it. In the present, I take the tablecloth from the drawer and hold it up to the light. The wheat stalks glow. Every stitch is a little crossing, a leaving and a returning that makes a whole. I run my thumb along the hem and feel my mother's patience. Then I fold it and put it away. The cast iron is cool now. The record player is quiet. Even the building seems to wait before it makes a sound. The sentence he gave me walks through the room looking for proof. Home is where love stays. It checks the chair by the window, the mug on the counter, the faint ring on the table where a bowl once sat. It looks toward the door where my son stood this afternoon and delivered his line as if it were a verdict. I picture Emily counting cabinets with her eyes, measuring a life that is not hers. I picture Michael practicing a hardness that never fit his face. The memory tilts under the weight of that picture, but it does not fall. Outside, the sky leans toward rain again. The glass darkens a shade. The river tightens its color. A horn complains and stops. Somewhere a neighbor drops a pan and laughs once at the noise. I breathe and let the air settle my hands. I remind myself that objects remember. Linen remembers. Cast iron remembers. A window remembers every pair of eyes that ever asked it for a view. I am not trying to rewind a life. I am letting a memory keep its name. I light the under-cabinet bulb, and the kitchen earns its warmth, back by degrees. I fill a pot with water and set it on low. Not stew this time, just steam. The quiet widens and becomes kind again. I look at the door with a calm I did not have an hour ago. The boy who said home is where love stays is still real. The man who said the penthouse is theirs is also real. I can carry both truths without letting either one decide who I am. Before the timer on the stove could reach a simmer, I let myself remember one more detail from that rainy night. The way Michael leaned his forehead to the window and traced a circle in the fog with his knuckle. The way he looked back at me, a question in his eyes that never needed language. The way I answered by refilling his bowl and setting my hand over his for a beat longer than manners require. A pledge without paperwork. If love stays, home stays. If love chooses to leave, I stay. The rain begins. The window collects its silver threads. I turn from the view and face the room I will protect. I know what I will do next, and I know whom to call when the water starts to whisper. I turned off the stove and wiped the countertop dry. The kitchen closed itself like a book. I slipped into my coat. The fabric held a chill, as if the room had already decided I did not belong to its weather. I folded the linen, checked the balcony door, and took my purse. The silence felt polite and final. I pulled the door shut and felt the seal press a thin draft against my cheek. On the threshold, I hesitated, hearing the apartment breathe the way a seashell holds an ocean. Departure can sound like consent. The hallway smelled of carpet cleaner. The elevator button circled my fingertip with amber. When the doors opened, a refrigerated hush slid over my skin. I pressed L for lobby and watched the numbers fall. 40, 39, 38. The hum under my shoes smoothed into one long note. My reflection in the steel looked like a woman practicing how to be smaller than a room. On 30, a man with a violin case entered. We exchanged the careful smile of strangers who agree to share silence. 23, 19, 15. The cables sang their metallic hymn. I wanted to ask whether music was his work or his rescue. I let the question rest. At 10, the doors opened on an empty corridor. The building offered me nowhere to go but down. 7, 4, 2. The bell chimed with borrowed cheer. The lobby received me with marble and air cold enough to find my collarbone. The concierge lifted a hand. I lifted mine. The revolving door gathered me and set me down on the avenue. The city breathed rain and metal. A taxi stopped as if it had been listening for my need. I gave the driver my Brooklyn address. He repeated it with patient vowels that reminded me of Samuel. We joined the flow. Lights opened and closed like gills. The bridges counted themselves across the water. The skyline stepped back. I drew a line in the window fog and watched it fade. My rental in Brooklyn is small. It is honest about its limits. The stairwell smells of old varnish and groceries. The third-floor lock yields with a reluctant turn. I like it for telling the truth about effort. Inside, the hardwood keeps a little stored sunlight. The radiator mines its secrets for winter. I set my purse on the counter and stood still until the room remembered me. The first night after a break has its own gravity. It drags at the lungs. It turns the ribs into a gate that will not swing wide. I filled a glass and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress offered plain kindness. Outside, a siren argued with the quiet. Somewhere a door slammed and stayed shut. Breath should be simple. Tonight it asked to be managed. In for 4 counts, out for 6. I coached myself like a beginner. My chest obeyed in inches. A tightness drew a small circle beneath my collarbone and refused to explain itself. I allowed it to exist. Resisting pain only sharpens it. The window was open the width of 2 fingers. Air moved with the soft grit of late traffic. I wanted the night to pass like a clean stitch. Instead, it worried a knot. I slid the suitcase from under the bed and lifted the album. The leather had the give of an old handshake. The corners were worn from years of turning and returning. I placed it on my lap and opened to the first page. Samuel stood in a snowfall of flour. Someone had caught him laughing with his eyes. I touched the picture with one finger. Paper stayed cool no matter how long I asked it to warm. I turned the page. Michael as a toddler with a wooden spoon, my mother by sunlit sheets, the tablecloth a small white flag speaking home, the bakery in winter, its windows fogged by bread's breath. Each image brought its own weather, my body tilted to match. As the pictures came nearer to now, a tremor joined my hands. Not a dramatic shaking, a fine, private unrest that made the corners quiver before they settled. I paused at a photo of Michael at 10, sleeves rolled, frosting a cake with surgeon seriousness. He had spelled happy with 1 P and refused to scrape it off because joy had already chosen its shape. I remembered how his laugh ran the hallway like a bright dog let loose. I remembered how he treated my hands as maps. The tremor advanced. I set the album on the blanket and pressed my palms together until warmth gathered. Then I lifted the book again. I breathed in. I breathed out. I named what lived in me: grief, fatigue, a low, stubborn hope that would not die. I closed the album and rested it against my knees. The room did not feel hostile. It felt watchful. I could see the corridor of hours between midnight and morning. Each hour would ask whether to replay or to rest. I turned off the lamp and let the city ride a shallow river of light across the ceiling. In that dim water, I allowed myself to float. Sleep came late and thin. Still, it came. Inside it, a sentence anchored itself, quiet and durable. I do not have to win tonight. I only have to stay. When I woke, the air had cooled. The room had kept my place. My hands were steady enough to pour water for tea. I warmed my palms around the cup and thanked the morning for arriving. Ordinary mercy counts, when grand gestures fail. The day ahead would ask for decisions. The phone would ring. The world would continue to speak in its grammar of need. For now, I stood at the window and watched a plane draw a patient arc across a new sky. The page had not been torn out, it had been turned. I met Frank on the stairs the next morning. The building smelled of coffee and wet newspapers from the corner deli. He paused 2 steps above me and tipped his cap. We had spoken in nods for months. Now his eyes studied my face as if he had heard my night breathing through the walls. "You look like someone carrying a room on her back," he said. I wanted to laugh. The sound stayed folded in my chest. I told him I was fine. He looked at the lie and did not argue. He stepped aside and let me pass, then followed me down. At the mailboxes, he sorted envelopes with a butcher's efficiency, bills to the left, catalogs to the right, a lone postcard in the middle that he turned over twice. I lingered with empty hands. He noticed, the cap tilted back, an invitation. "Coffee," he said. "The bodega on the corner is honest about its coffee. Sit with me. It will keep your hands busy." We took the window table. Frank stirred sugar into his paper cup, then set the stirrer down as if ending a small prayer. "I had a house," he began. "Bayside, 2 stories, a porch big enough for 7 chairs and a radio. Ruth grew tomatoes against the south fence. My boys did homework at the kitchen table. On summer nights, neighbors brought peaches, and we traded jokes until the mosquitoes won. It was not a grand house. It was a faithful one." He smiled, then the smile closed itself. "My younger boy, Danny, could fix anything but his own luck. He would change your tire in the rain and forget to cash his paycheck. A contractor strung him along. Promises instead of wages. You know the script. By winter, he had a stack of bills and a look that said he could not see spring. Frank lifted the cup but did not drink. He asked me to borrow against the house. Not sell, just borrow. He swore he would square it in a year. 6 months if the jobs broke right. Ruth said, wait and think. I said we would not let our boy drown while we counted spoons. I signed. It started with interest, then moved to principal. Soon the notes were breeding like mice. Danny said he had it handled. He was handling it the way a man handles a tide. Ruth clipped coupons and planted another row. I took odd shifts and pretended they were hobbies. The bank was polite until it was not. The day the man came with the clipboard, Ruth was baking. The house smelled like cinnamon and old paper. He said the timing was unfortunate. He said the paperwork was complete. He said we would have a reasonable window to vacate. I asked whether he had ever moved. 35 years of Sundays. He said he understood. I told him he did not. Frank's laugh was brief and rusted. Neighbors offered couches. Someone knew a cousin with a basement. Church ladies packed our frames with the gentleness of a sacrament. Danny stopped coming by. Shame is a locksmith that works from the inside. Ruth slept 2 weeks at her sister's and never came back. She said she could not stand to hear a new family finding our light switches. He finally drank. I have this apartment now. It is fine. The radiator knows my name. The super fixes leaks before they become sermons. I buy flowers on Fridays and let them audition for joy on the sill. People survive worse. Still, sometimes, when a bus door opens, I can smell cinnamon. I look for Ruth in the reflection and find my hat instead. He looked at me. I nodded. Truth is lighter when someone lifts with you. He leaned closer. Someone took your room. I can see the empty frame around you. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was a moment. The shape of the loss is the same. You want to be the good mother who waits on the porch with the light on. You think gentleness will escort a hard thing into being soft. I am old enough to tell you this. Softness invites teeth when the world decides you are edible. He went on. I do not know your boy. I am sure he can be kind. I am sure he has reasons that feel like facts. But there is a line children cannot cross without becoming a different species. Ask me how I know. He slid the postcard across. A beach, 2 chairs, no people. On the back, in careful block letters, Danny had written a return address and nothing else. Frank tapped the card. He is sober now. He fixes dishwashers in Florida. He calls on Sundays. He says he wants to visit. I tell him he should. I remind him I live on the 3rd floor and there is no elevator. Stairs are part of the price. I forgive him every morning. I cannot afford to forget. The coffee had gone lukewarm. Neither of us minded. You will be told to be patient. Patience is holy until it becomes a leash. You will be told that family is everything. Family is everything until it eats the person you are. Grief will borrow your voice and try to speak for you. Let it cry, then take your mouth back. He stood. I stood with him. The bodega bell chimed. A child dragged a bright backpack past. The world declared itself open for business. Frank put a gentle hand on my shoulder and met my eyes. I felt the sentence waiting in my mouth. I knew I would need it before the day ended today. Write your boundary while your hand is still steady, he said. Invite love. Lock the door against entitlement. Leave the porch light on for the person, not the behavior. And Teresa, listen to me, please. Do not let yourself become a guest in your own home. Frank's sentence followed me from the bodega to the subway like a steady drum. I did not hurry. Each block taught my feet how to belong to the ground again. At the turnstile, I decided to call Linda. We had not spoken in too long. At Samuel's funeral, she pressed soup into my hands and stayed until I ate. Linda listens with her whole posture. She also practices real estate law without flinching. She answered before the second ring and said my name with care and certainty. I told her I needed coffee and truth in equal measure. She told me to come to her office. 3 stops if the train behaved. I held my purse close as rehearsal for holding what was mine. Her building sits over a florist. The elevator delivered me to a corridor lined with old maps. She opened the door before I could knock. More silver threaded her hair. The same precise warmth stayed in her eyes. Do you want to keep being pushed out or step back into your own life? The question needed no cushion. I felt my spine answer before my mouth did. I told her about the penthouse, the keys on the counter, Emily's brisk tone, Michael's sentence shaped like a verdict. I told her about the white tablecloth and the rain, about Frank on the stairs, about the line that kept standing inside me like a guard. Linda rolled her chair to the computer and opened city records. She asked for my full name, the block and lot, the purchase date. I handed over the folder from my desk drawer, the one with copies Samuel used to tease me about. We went line by line: deed, mortgage, satisfaction, tax receipts, insurance, bylaws, minutes from the meeting when they approved me. My signature walked the pages like an old friend. No joint tenancy, no transfer, no lingering encumbrance. My name stood alone. She looked up. Your ownership is clean. What your son believes he can give away does not belong to him. She set her glasses on the desk. Grief distorts judgment. Entitlement rewrites language. People start calling gifts obligations. They rename taking as helping. The law does not share their vocabulary. Something clicked in my chest like a lock finding home. Not triumph, orientation. I had been walking in fog. Now I could see the curb. Linda printed the abstract and slid it toward me. Then she drew a rectangle on a legal pad and labeled 3 paths. Keep the title with added security. Move the asset into a revocable trust with me as trustee. or transfer title to a charitable foundation while I retain a life estate so I can live there and direct the property toward mission later. Each path had costs and benefits. Each was a different kind of boundary. We made tea in the tiny kitchen. She told me about an aunt who let a cousin stay for a season and woke years later to find him claiming the house. The court corrected the deed. The family never recovered its shape. Linda was not trying to frighten me. She was offering consequence without cruelty. Back at the desk, she asked for my values before my choice. What outcome would let you sleep? I told her I wanted to honor Samuel, to stop teaching Michael that my love was a door he could kick open, to keep my home without turning my heart into concrete. Linda nodded and said the law could separate rights from resentments. I could keep one and release the other. She recommended the charitable foundation with a life estate. It would make my intent unmistakable. It would put the asset beyond easy manipulation. It would still let me live there. We began the paperwork. Name of the foundation, purpose, governance, trustee, successor, language about housing dignity that sounded like Samuel's hand on my shoulder. I signed with a pen that did not tremble. Linda filed notices and scheduled a notary. She reviewed the next steps, record the deed, file the life estate memorandum, notify the board and insurer, store copies securely. She handed me a checklist and wrote today's date at the top. We paused. She set both palms on the folder as if blessing bread. I will keep duplicates. You keep originals. If anyone tells you that love requires surrender, show them page 4. I stood. The room felt taller. At the door, she touched my elbow. Prepare for the conversation that will come. Decide your words now so you do not borrow them from anger later. On the sidewalk, I bought peonies and carried them to the subway like a soft shield. I held the bouquet and the folder and felt the weight divide itself properly. Paper for the law, petals for the living. On the train, I practiced sentences. I will not argue. I will not explain what the law already declares. I will speak once and let silence work. I slipped a card from the folder and wrote a line for myself. Hold what is yours without apology. Back in Brooklyn, I set the peonies in a pitcher and placed the folder beside the album. I called Linda to confirm the notary time. She reminded me to breathe and to eat dinner. Before bed, I read the checklist again, tracing each verb with my fingertip. Prepare, review, sign, record, notify, store. Verbs for a life returning to its own center. I placed the folder in the drawer and slid it closed. The latch caught with a satisfying click. The apartment felt less like a waiting room and more like a place with plans. At the window, the city exhaled and the river kept its steady line. I let Frank's sentence meet Linda's question. Do not be a guest in your own home. Step back into your life. The night held me without hurry. My breathing matched the river's patient pace. I slept and woke steadier. The plan was ready. By morning, the checklist had hardened into resolve. Action made a cleaner pillow than worry. I called Linda at 9. She answered with the calm of someone who sharpens pencils before storms. We met at her office again. She began without ceremony. A charitable foundation, she said, named for Samuel Lane. Purpose anchored in housing dignity. Structure built to keep the assets safe and useful. We would transfer title of the penthouse to the foundation. I would retain a life estate, the recorded right to live there, to enjoy it, to maintain it, and to direct its mission while I lived. When I died, the property would remain with the foundation to support families in transition. Clear lines, clean law, no room for confusion. Linda slid a draft across her desk. The name felt right when I read it. The Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth. She pointed at clauses in calm sequence: conveyance, life estate memorandum, maintenance obligations, insurance, tax status, board composition, reporting, charitable purpose written in plain English. She had built a house out of words and invited me to test the hinges. I signed the formation papers. She called the notary. The stamp landed with crisp grace. "It is not drama," she said. "It is design. We are designing your boundaries so they do not need to shout." At the bank, we opened a foundation account. I signed the cards. The branch manager shook my hand as if greeting Samuel. We recorded the initial capitalization. Most of the value would be the penthouse itself. We walked to the county office to record the deed. The clerk checked our packet and nodded. When the scanner clicked, a line shifted in the city's memory. The penthouse moved from my personal name to the foundation's ledger. The life estate held my signature like a seal. I asked Linda if guilt made sense. She shook her head. "You are not hiding, you are stewarding. It is not selfish to put on your oxygen mask first. It is not cruel to stop confusing surrender with love." Back at her office, we wrote letters. To the condo board, to the insurer, to my accountant, to the foundation's temporary address. Each carried the same plain sentence near the top. Ownership has been transferred to the Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth, and Teresa Lane retains a recorded life estate. No melodrama, no pleading, just the outline of a new architecture. We scheduled the first board meeting, small and dignified. Linda and I would serve until we recruited 2 additional members with housing experience. I suggested Henry from the building as a community advisor. He knows what safety looks like when a lobby goes quiet. Linda nodded. She turned her monitor so I could see the digital folder grow. Titles stacked like bricks, deed, life estate memorandum, articles, bylaws, IRS acknowledgement, bank resolution, board notice, insurance endorsement request. That afternoon, I walked to the river and leaned into the railing. Barges moved like patient beasts. Gulls stitched bright arcs through the weather. The feeling that rose in me was not vengeance. It was symmetry. For years, I had taught my son that love meant access without asking. Today, I taught the world and myself a different lesson. Love has doors. Doors have locks. Locks open by invitation and close by wisdom. Power did not feel like a fist. It felt like a spine. I stood straighter. I rehearsed the conversation I would not pick, but would not avoid. If Michael asked where the keys were, I would say he already had a pair. If he asked where the ownership went, I would say it went where meaning goes when it matures, outward. On the way home, I bought a small brass plate from a hardware store. The letters were square and simple. The Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth. I would place it discreetly near the entry, not as a boast, as a compass. I cleaned the kitchen table at home and laid out a blank sheet, wrote the mission in longhand before typing it. Handwritten words steady the hand. Shelter keeps weather out. Care keeps loneliness out. Law keeps predation out. This would hold. I signed and breathed easier. In Brooklyn, I set the folder in the drawer and brewed tea. I thought of Samuel's hands dusted white, of Michael's grin when he misspelled happy. Both true. Both mine to keep without letting either write my future. Strength can be gentle. Gentleness can be strong when it finally chooses a frame. At dusk, I walked to church and lit a candle for whoever might rest in that penthouse after I am gone, a single flame practicing endurance. I asked for a future where a family could set down their bags in a room that remembers kindness. I asked to keep becoming a woman who knows the difference between an open heart and an unlocked door. Phone on silent, I returned home and stuck a note to my refrigerator. Read, rest, do not explain. I set an alarm for morning errands. Linda would file the final forms with the state. I would draft a mission sentence for the foundation website, a page that says, "We believe shelter is not a prize, but a right. We believe dignity fits in the doorway with a key." When I lay down, I did not count losses. I counted verbs again, formed, signed, recorded, notified, honored. The room felt taller, the air less borrowed. The day had not taken anything I needed. It had returned something I forgot I owned. In the hush before sleep, I heard my voice with new steadiness. If you think that is what is right, then that is what it will be. But right now, right has my handwriting. The reversal had begun, not a battle, a return to center. My breathing matched the steady traffic on the avenue. My heart moved like a pendulum that had found its clock. The morning settled into a steady rhythm. Papers filed, emails sent, tea cooling on the counter beside the checklist. I could feel the new architecture holding, quiet but solid. Around noon, my phone lit with Michael's name. I answered before courage had time to dress itself as fear. "Mom, quick heads up," he said, brisk, as if he were reserving a conference room. "We're moving Emily's parents into the Penthouse this weekend. Saturday for furniture, Sunday for boxes. The elevator slot is confirmed. I'll bring a locksmith to change the cylinders. It will be smoother if you're not there." The words did not land. They marched. I looked at the kettle, at the steam lifting in one steady ribbon, at the brass plate on the counter waiting for screws. My spine found its shape. "I understand," I said, each syllable precise and clean. He filled the silence with instructions. "I'll need the spare key from your desk. Leave it with Henry. Emily's dad has a bad knee. Fewer steps would help. Also, if you could remove your personal things by Friday, it's awkward to pack around someone else's memories." I kept my breath even. "I understand." The sentence fit in my mouth like a measured stone. He misheard kindness as compliance. Entitlement often wears that costume. "Great, this is for the best. I know you barely use the place. Thank you for being reasonable." Paper rustled. He was already moving on. "I'll text the schedule." "I understand," I said for the third and final time, and ended the call. The room did not change. The light did. My pulse stepped down a staircase and stood on the landing. Silence expanded its lungs. I placed the phone face down and slid the checklist beside it. I turned the kettle off and poured water into the sink. Steam dissolved. My hands did not shake. The power of not explaining filled the room like a tide turning quietly under a pier. Text messages arrived in a staccato parade. Saturday 9 to 1, Sunday 10 to 4, locksmith at noon. I read each line as if it belonged to a stranger's itinerary. Then I muted the thread. Boundary set. Conversation complete. I cleaned the counter with slow, deliberate circles. Repetition is a gentle engine. I wrapped the brass plate in tissue and placed it in my tote with the tiny screws and the driver. I set the folder in the drawer and locked it. The tiny click sounded like agreement. The apartment's hum returned to its ordinary key. Afternoon stretched into a longer light. I walked to the river and let the wind proofread my posture. Barges moved as if the water belonged to them. Gulls debated in curt syllables. I rehearsed nothing. I allowed the day to settle around me without asking for permission. Back home, I set rice to simmer and sliced ginger thin enough to disappear. The knife moved true. Muscle memory can be a mercy. Night arrived on quiet shoes. I washed the bowl and left it to dry. Then I opened the album and placed it on my lap. The leather warmed. The tremor did not return. I turned pages with a steady thumb. The pictures did their work without argument. Love, labor, small holidays, a life measured in loaves and sleeves rolled above the elbow. I let the page rest on Michael pressing his palm to the penthouse glass, rain shining on his knuckles. The image held its own sentence about home. I wrote a single line on an index card and tucked it beneath the album's ribbon. Speak once. Let silence finish the paragraph. The instruction felt like a lantern I could carry with one hand. Sleep did not come early. Pain pulled its chair close. Clarity sat beside it. I lay on my side and counted the breath. In for 4, out for 6. Between counts, I listed truths I would not negotiate. I am the steward of my home. Love does not demand theft. Boundaries are kind when they keep poison out. Around midnight, I rose and stood at the window. Brooklyn kept its hush. A late bus sighed and continued. I pressed my palm to the glass the way Michael once had, and the cool answered. In the reflection, I could see the outline of my shoulders, squared without effort. Grief still lived in the room. It did not run the meeting. I brewed chamomile and sat at the table with a pen. I began a letter to myself, dated and signed, not for court, not for argument, for memory. Today I chose the frame that fits my life. Today I learned that saying less can carry more weight than a speech. Today I learned that I understand is a door that closes softly and locks itself on the right side. When the cup was empty, I rinsed it and folded a towel over the sink edge. I turned off the lights and lay down again. The bed welcomed. The spine listened to its own instructions. I pictured Saturday the way one pictures weather on a forecast, systems moving, people packing, a locksmith testing a knob that would refuse to cooperate. I did not plan a confrontation. I did not rehearse pain. I placed my trust in the documents already filed, the signatures already dry, the law already spoken. Sleep came like a tide that respects the shore. When it lifted, I dreamed of a house with open windows and doors that knew my name, a place where light waited and did not lecture. I woke before dawn. The room washed in the first pale proof of morning. The phone lay dark. The city inhaled. On the table, the index card waited. Speak once. Let silence finish the paragraph. I slid it into my purse beside my keys and the small screwdriver. If the storm was coming, I would meet it standing, not shouting, not pleading, present, steady, and already anchored. I felt profoundly ready. Saturday arrived with a clean blue sky, the kind of weather people call perfect. I was not at the Penthouse. Instead, I sat at a small table in a quiet cafe in Carroll Gardens, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of me and the brass plate wrapped in tissue at my side. From where I sat, the city moved without me, and for once, that was intentional. Mr. Henry and I had spoken the night before. He knew exactly what to do. His job wasn't to block the elevator or to argue, it was to deliver an envelope. Inside, there was no confrontation, no insults, just the truth, printed on legal paper, stamped, signed, recorded. By 9:05, they arrived. Michael first walking ahead as if to shield Emily's parents from any inconvenience. Emily followed, her lips pursed in a line that looked like satisfaction. Behind them came her father, leaning heavily on a cane, and her mother clutching a shopping bag full of cleaning supplies. The building's front doors sighed open, and Mr. Henry, dressed in his neat gray sweater, stepped forward with the calm precision of a man who had watched decades of human drama in the same lobby. "Good morning," he said, with the kind of courtesy that can be more disarming than hostility. He reached into his inside pocket and withdrew the envelope. "Before you head upstairs, Mr. Lane, this is for you." Michael frowned, the impatience already visible in his jawline. "What is it?" Henry didn't answer that question directly. "From your mother's attorney," he said simply, and placed the envelope in Michael's hand. Emily glanced at it, a spark of unease flickering through her expression before she masked it. "We can read it later," she said, already stepping toward the elevator. But Michael had always been curious to a fault. He tore the top of the envelope, sliding out the crisp stack of papers. His eyes scanned the first page, moving quickly at first, then slowing, his mouth tightening. Emily's father leaned closer. "What does it say?" Michael didn't answer immediately. His gaze froze on the line that mattered most. Owner of record, the Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth. Life Estate Teresa Lane. He read it again, as if repetition could change it. His face shifted from confusion to disbelief to something harder to name, an awareness that the rules of the game had been rewritten without his permission. Emily reached for the papers, her hand trembling slightly. She read over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing at the legal language that was impossible to twist into something else. "So, this means..." Henry, still standing a polite distance away, filled in the silence. "It means the foundation owns the property. Your mother retains the legal right to live there for the rest of her life. No one moves in without her consent. Emily's mother adjusted the strap on her bag, suddenly studying the floor tiles as though they might offer a way out. Her husband shifted his cane from one hand to the other, his mouth opening but no words coming. Michael's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous," he muttered, but there was no weight behind it, only the hollow sound of someone trying to reclaim ground that had already been paved over. Henry's tone remained steady, almost gentle. "I was instructed to make sure you understood before proceeding. The documents are all filed with the county. It's final." The lobby air grew heavier, as if the marble itself had absorbed the tension. Emily folded the papers and handed them back to Michael with a small shake of her head. He didn't meet her eyes. Behind them, the doorman pressed the elevator button, but no one stepped forward. For a long, awkward moment, the group stood in the center of the lobby, their plans dissolving in the stillness. Emily's father cleared his throat. "Maybe we should discuss this elsewhere." Michael didn't argue. He slid the envelope under his arm and turned toward the doors. Emily followed, her face set but pale. Her parents trailed behind, their earlier energy deflated. Henry watched them leave without a word, then turned back to his desk, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders a little straighter. I wasn't there to see it, but I could picture every detail. Henry would have taken a moment to smooth the papers on his desk, perhaps even allowed himself a quiet smile. He's the kind of man who believes in justice, not because it's loud, but because it's steady. At the cafe, I stirred my coffee, feeling the weight in my chest lighten by a fraction. There was no gloating, no adrenaline rush, just the knowledge that the boundaries I had set were holding exactly as they were meant to. The barista passed by with a tray of clean mugs, and for the first time in weeks, I realized my hands were resting flat on the table, steady. Somewhere uptown, Michael was reading the same sentences again, realizing they were unchangeable. I imagined the moment he would look at Emily and understand that this wasn't a fight he could win with charm or pressure. And I imagined Emily realizing that the woman she thought could be cornered had, instead, drawn a circle she could not cross. Outside, the sunlight had shifted. I unwrapped the brass plate from its tissue and ran my fingers over the letters. The Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth. It felt cool and certain in my hands. I wasn't planning to install it today, but I knew I would soon. Not as a declaration for them, but as a quiet reminder for me that the home Samuel and I built now had a future that belonged to something larger than anyone's entitlement. When I left the cafe, I walked without rush. My steps had their own rhythm again. Somewhere, the elevator in the Penthouse building was sitting idle, the weekend plans erased. The storm had arrived and passed, leaving behind only the clear, unmistakable shape of what was mine. The weekend ended without another message. By the close of the third week, my phone had learned silence. Michael did not call. Emily did not text. The thread now lay slack. I moved through the days like someone reclaiming rooms in her own house, with steady footsteps that remembered where the light switches were. On Monday of the first week, I returned to the Penthouse with the brass plate and a screwdriver in my pocket. Mr. Henry nodded when I entered. He did not ask questions. He simply set a small box of clean screws on the counter. Upstairs, the hallway held a faint lemon smell. I unlocked the door. The latch gave with that soft click that sounds like agreement. Inside, the rooms opened their quiet. I set my tote down and walked straight to the balcony. The Hudson wore a late morning blue that had made peace with gray. Gulls rode the wind. I let the air find my hairline and the back of my neck. The city spoke in its usual grammar, traffic as heartbeat, horns as commas, footsteps as clauses. I brewed tea. The kettle answered with its old whistle, unhurried, apologizing for nothing. Steam climbed. Bergamot drew a clean citrus line through the room. I carried the cup to the armchair by the window. The chair is not photogenic, but its arms have learned the shape of me. Samuel used to nap there with the paper inching toward the floor. Michael used to read there when rain made the balcony raw. I ran my hand along the worn wood until warmth gathered in my palm. I unwrapped the plate and mounted it on the interior wall near the entry. The Samuel Lane Foundation for Home and Hearth. Letters, square and certain. I did not admire it long. I made lunch, toast and eggs and a tomato that tasted of July, though the calendar disagreed. After, I washed the plate and cup and let them dry. I read condo minutes and placed copies in the foundation folder. This did not feel like defense. It felt like tending a garden. Days organized themselves. Morning walks along the river. Afternoons at the table with bylaws and a pencil. Evenings given to books whose sentences walked instead of sprinted. Sometimes I brought peonies home. Sometimes the grocery roses auditioned for joy and won. The apartment settled. I settled with it. On the second week, a storm crossed the city. The balcony caught its first heavy drops. The kettle's whistle and the wind's keen braided into a sober duet. I moved the armchair a hand's width so the lamp met the page without glare. I wrote letters to potential board members and sealed them with a hope that did not wear perfume. My phone stayed on the counter. The screen stayed dark. At night, I slept without arguing with the clock. In the mornings, I stretched and listened. The building whispered its small, familiar sounds. On Sundays, I set the white runner instead of the whole cloth. A bowl of fruit stood like a modest holiday. The phrase that once pinched began to loosen. Home is where love stays. Love had not left. It had changed its furniture. By the third week, Mr. Henry called to ask whether I wanted a package left at the desk. I came down and signed. Inside were insurance endorsements stamped, recorded. Plain proof for people who respect paper. We spoke about weather. He did not mention the Saturday with the envelope, neither did I. Dignity often looks like two people refusing to pick at a healed seam. Back upstairs, I sat in the armchair and watched the sky dramatize itself. A barge slid upriver. A helicopter stitched burrows. A child on a nearby balcony counted pigeons. I realized I had not checked the time in hours. The room held me as if it had been practicing. Sometimes sorrow tapped the door. I let it in, gave it a chair not far from mine, and poured it tea without sugar. It did not wreck the place. It looked at what I had repaired and left before dark. The rule became simple. Everything may visit. Nothing may take up residence without permission. One evening, I wrote Michael a short letter I did not send. I love you. I will not discuss the foundation. I hope your work is honest. When you can speak without trying to move furniture that is not yours, I will answer the door. Writing it loosened a knot no one else could see. I began to speak out loud sometimes, not to fill space, but to let my mouth learn the shape of calm. I told Samuel about the plate. I told my mother her wheat-stitch border still tutors my patience. I told the chair it had earned its keep. The apartment listened and answered by standing. By the end of the third week, the balcony and I shared a rhythm. I knew when the gust would turn sharp at the corner. It knew when I needed a wind that lifted hair from my forehead without stealing heat from my tea. Morning light climbed the opposite building. At noon, the river scrolled hammered tin. At dusk, the city walked more slowly. I do not know what Michael told Emily's parents, or whether his anger turned inward or outward or into silence. I do know the boundaries I set have begun to hold my heart in the right shape. If the phone rings tomorrow, I will answer with the sentences I practiced and let silence finish the paragraph. If it does not ring, I will steep another pot and sit in the armchair. I will watch the river keep its patient appointment with the sea. The house has relearned my quiet. I have relearned its. When the kettle sings, I do not rush. I lift it. Steam rises. For a moment, the room smells like a promise I can keep, and I breathe. The fourth Monday carried ordinary light across the floor when the intercom buzzed. Mr. Henry's voice was careful. "Mrs. Lane, your son is here. He has a guest." I thanked him and pressed the door release. I set 2 cups on the counter and chose the smaller kettle. The knock came 3 minutes later. Michael stood in the doorway, jaw set, Emily beside him, a fine line between her brows. She held a folder. They came in. The door clicked shut. I gestured to the table. They remained standing. Emily began. "We need to talk about what you did." Her voice was crisp. "You blindsided us. My parents had movers scheduled. We had a locksmith. You made us look foolish." Michael folded his arms. "Mom, this was extreme. You barely live here. We offered a practical solution. Instead, you hid behind a lawyer and a foundation." He made the word foundation sound like an accusation. I poured tea into 1 cup and left the other empty. I asked whether they wanted any. Neither answered. So I held my cup with both hands and let the warmth instruct my fingers. "I did not hide," I said. "I recorded a decision. The law is public clarity." I sat. They watched me as if I had changed height. Emily took a step forward. "This is selfish. A family needs housing. You have a place in Brooklyn. You are alone. Why should all this space sit around grieving with you when it could hold people who need it?" Michael let her argument lead his. "Mom, we tried to do something that made sense for everyone." I set my cup down. "Selfish is taking from the one who gave you everything." Emily's chin tilted. Michael blinked. I went on. "I worked for this home. I sold the bakery that paid for your schools and your wedding. I sat with bills no one else wanted to open. I slept beside a man through chemo and held his hand. I bought this place so I could learn how to breathe again. None of that entitles you to repurpose my breath." Emily gripped the folder. "You are weaponizing memory to avoid generosity. My parents are decent people. They have done nothing to you. They have done nothing for me either," I said, "and they are not my responsibility. Your husband is." Michael bristled. "That is not fair. It is accurate. Fairness asks whether a rule applies equally. Accuracy asks whether a statement describes reality. The reality is simple. You told me the home was theirs. You banned me from entering. I answered with a boundary that does not need your permission to stand." He took a slow breath. "You could have talked to us first." "I did," I said. "You said the decision was made. You informed me of logistics. You brought a locksmith. Conversation requires room for movement. You brought a bulldozer." Silence gathered. The kettle ticked as it cooled. Emily placed the folder on the table and opened it. She pushed a printout toward me. A list of their expenses, rent, medications, repairs. She tapped the total. "Tell me you can look at this and keep your door closed." I looked. Then I slid the paper back. "I can, and I will." Generosity is not a synonym for surrender. Charity that erases a boundary is not charity. It is self-erasure dressed as virtue. The foundation will help families after I am gone. Until then, this home remains what it was meant to be, a place where I can live without being farmed for parts. Michael's shoulders tightened. Then some of the fight leaked away. He stared at the brass plate by the entry as if it had spoken. His voice dropped. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because you were not asking," I said. "You were taking. When a person arrives with a verdict, I do not owe them a preface." He rubbed his eyes. "I thought we were on the same side." "We are," I said, "when the side is dignity, not when the side is entitlement." Emily folded her arms. "You have chosen a plaque over people. I have chosen stewardship over chaos. I have chosen to stop teaching my son that love is a door he can break and call it coming home." Michael looked at the windows again. The river kept its line. When he spoke, his voice was smaller, the way it used to be when he brought home a report card with a quiet mistake. "I did not think it would hurt you like this." "It hurt long before the paperwork," I said. "It hurt when my son looked at me and saw square footage. It hurt when the word mother had to fight the word asset for air." He swallowed. "What do you want me to do? Start by hearing me. Then decide if you want to be my son in a way that does not require my keys." The room went still. Emily shifted her weight. The folder sighed. Michael finally spoke. "If I apologize, will you change it back? An apology is not a tool for undoing consequences. It is a bridge for future crossings. The structure remains. You are welcome to visit when you can leave your bulldozer at the curb." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, then not. Emily exhaled. The sound was a blade set down. She reached for his sleeve. "We should go." He nodded. At the door, he paused and looked at the plate again. He turned. "Thank you for the tea," he said. "You did not drink any," I said. He glanced at the empty cup I had set for him. "Maybe next time." They left. The door closed with its familiar click. The air rearranged itself. The room grew quiet the way water grows clear after a stone sinks. I stood and listened to the silence finish the paragraph. Outside, the river held steady. Inside, my boundaries finally did. News moved through the building the way weather moves along the river, steady, impersonal, and impossible to deny. Mr. Henry phoned one afternoon to ask if I wanted a package carried upstairs. When I signed at the desk, he straightened the mail and said, with professional calm, that my son had requested numbers for movers. He provided a list, kept his voice even, and returned to his ledger. Later, the doorman mentioned that Emily had asked about elevator reservations for another address across the river. I rode up with the box under my arm. Relief and regret walked beside me like relatives who no longer argue but refuse to sit together. Inside the apartment, I opened the carton and found tidy insurance endorsements stamped recorded. I set the papers in the foundation folder and breathed the kind of breath that is not a victory shout, just a fit. By the end of the week, a neighbor with a cheerful dog told me a couple resembling Emily's parents had toured a modest place in Queens near her sister's building. She apologized for intruding. I thanked her for treating facts as sunlight. When I was alone again, I let my lungs lengthen. Frank found me on the stoop the next morning. We sat with coffee and watched delivery trucks practice their choreography. I told him what I had heard. He listened without designing my feelings. Then he nodded once, a veteran's nod, final and kind. "You did not let yourself become a guest in your own home." We let the words stand. We spoke of smaller things. His son had kept his schedule another month. I said our board had 2 confirmations and a housing advocate to brief us. Frank said peaches would be good if I did not mind a bruise or 2. I said bruises never bothered me. Back upstairs, I polished the brass plate. The letters woke under the lemon cloth. The chair by the window wore the afternoon. I sat with tea. Regret took a seat near the balcony and minded its posture. Relief stood by the stove and pretended not to stare. Between them, the air stayed easy. I allowed myself to think of Michael, not the man with plans and deadlines, but the boy who once slept on this chair during thunderstorms, shoes on, mouth open, trusting that sentences would be softer in the morning. I miss that boy. Missing did not make me a fool. Loving someone is not permission to be stolen from. The river underlined that point by moving forward. On Thursday, my reflection in a shop window surprised me by looking composed. I carried flowers home as if they were evidence. In the mail stack lay an envelope with my name in Michael's handwriting. The note inside was brief and careful. "We are looking at places. I will be in touch when I can be a better version of myself. No bargaining, no timetable, no thunder." I sat down and let my shoulders drop. This intention beat quietly. I slid the note beneath the family album and closed the cover with a palm that did not shake. I set an extra cup on the table the way you set aside a chair for a guest who has not arrived yet. Hope should have manners. It should set the table and then leave the room alone. Saturday brought peaches. Frank chose the bruised ones and said sweetness hides under the hurt if you give it time. We ate one on the steps. He wiped his thumb on a handkerchief and studied me. "You have learned the shape of your yes," he said. I laughed out loud. Nights found their rhythm again. I checked the locks, touched the chair back, and turned the lamps dark. The river whispered to the ocean. Somewhere across a different borough, a landlord turned a key for a family that had not needed to push anyone else aside to enter. I wished Emily's parents easy stairs and a patch of afternoon light. Blessing them cost me nothing. Regret kept quieter company now. Relief learned to rest a hand on my shoulder. Between them, I kept room for curiosity. What will our next conversation be like? What can I say that is true and short? What can I refuse without ceremony? I wrote to Linda with an update, thanked her for her good law, and asked about best practices for our first board meeting. She responded with bullet points and one line: "Boundaries are hospitality for the self." I printed the email and tucked it into the folder. On Sunday evening, I moved the armchair a few inches so the lamp would fall perfectly on the page. I read a chapter about houses that hold women. The kettle sang, the cup fit my hands, wind pressed its cool cheek to the glass and left. The phone was quiet. The quiet resembled peace. Before bed, I stood at the balcony and watched the city choose its lights. I let the river settle my pulse. Relief and regret stood beside me like two old neighbors who had reached a truce. Then I closed the door and gave the chair my weight. The room held. I held too. My home had kept its shape, and so, finally, had I. Midweek, Mr. Henry rang again with the same even courtesy. He said the elevator reservations had been released and the locksmith had canceled his slot. His tone did not sharpen. He delivered facts the way a good clock delivers time. I thanked him and, after we hung up, stood at the window with a gratitude that did not need a speech. The building had returned to its old rhythm. The lobby would host packages and strollers, not a takeover. I brewed tea. The whistle marked an ending. I opened the balcony door a hand's width and let the Hudson carry tension out into clear air while I breathed slowly, gratefully. Rain began soft across the glass. The river accepted the change with patience. I turned the lamp low and took the album from the shelf, the leather warm from the day. I did not sit to relive a wound. I sat to close a page without tearing it. I opened to the rainy night I have carried for months. The white tablecloth with wheat stitched along the hem, the stew in the cast iron, steam lifting in quiet spirals, a saxophone on the record player, not rushing, offering space instead of answers. Michael at the window, his palm on the fogged pane, a circle traced and disappearing. He turned, eyes bright with work and weather, and said the sentence that rearranged the room. Home is where love stays. Memory brings its own weather. For a long time that night arrived as thunder. Tonight it came like obedient rain that knew where to go. I let the page rest on my knees. I studied the edges silvery with time. I noticed the corner softened by years of thumbs. The ache I expected did not rise. In its place, a gentler weight settled, like a shawl placed across my shoulders. I remembered details grief had hidden. The spoon's chip near the handle, the crease down the linen where my mother folded it the same way for decades so the fabric would learn discipline and reward it with grace. The way Michael laughed when the first spoonful of stew surprised him with relief. Even the jazz returned in ordinary notes. I closed my eyes and let the scene pass in an honest frame. Things were true and not permanent. Love filled a room and then asked for a different address. A good sentence can be misused later by someone who wants your keys. The sentence remains good. The theft does not. Knowing this made room in me for breath, room for both the boy and the man, room for my own spine. I turned another page. Samuel in flower-dusted laughter. My parents younger than I am now, shoulders square with quiet dignity. Friends whose names the album still remembers when my tongue does not. Nothing reached out to take from me. Everything remained where it belonged, on paper that knows how to protect and release. I felt the room confirm what the river had rehearsed. Present tense matters most. Past tense can be kept without living inside it. The rain thickened and then thinned. I brewed mint tea and waited while the leaves lent the water their green. I carried the cup back to the armchair. I set the album down and rested my hands on the worn wood arms as if greeting old friends who had learned better boundaries. A question rose, simple and clean. If I could walk back into that night, would I change the cloth? Would I guard the sentence on Michael's lips? Would I ask the future for better manners? I listened and did not invent answers. Some nights arrive as they must, to teach which words to keep and which doors to lock. I opened the balcony door a hand's width. The Hudson breathed. The tea cooled into usefulness. I lifted the cup and spoke one line out loud, not to the room, but to the woman seated in it. I have come back to the right place at the right time. Saying it did not cue triumph. It cued alignment. My ribs loosened as if a careful hand had freed a stuck clasp. I could feel where regret ended and loyalty began. Not loyalty to a fantasy or to a script written for mothers who never stop bleeding. Loyalty to the life I am living, to the chair that holds me, to the law that steadies me, to the small plate on the wall with Samuel's name set in brass. I walked to the entry and touched the plate. The foundation will one day carry other people's boxes across this threshold and call that dignity. Until then, the apartment will hold my mornings, my names, my quiet. I returned to the chair and placed the album on the table beside it. I let it rest open to the rainy page. The past may sit here when it asks politely. It may not demand my seat. I noticed the unbroken line between that night and this one. My hand stirring stew because hunger insists on care. My hand signing papers because safety insists on clarity. My hand now holding tea because healing insists on warmth. 3 gestures of the same verb, performed by a woman who has stopped confusing softness with surrender. Wind reached in and moved a strand of hair across my forehead. I tucked it back. I slid a blank card from the drawer and wrote a sentence for the album's pocket. When I am tempted to read pain where only a closed chapter lies, remember the chair, remember the river, remember the plate. I replaced the card and shut the leather covers with a sound like a book agreeing to be a book. I carried it to the shelf and pressed the spine until it found its neighbors. Then I walked the rooms once, not to check for threats, but to greet what is mine. Stove cool, balcony secure, towel folded over the sink, lamp off. At the window, I set my palm to the glass. The city returned the gesture without drama. Somewhere across a borough, a younger woman was setting a table. Somewhere else, a son was practicing better speech. My job was not to arrange those rooms. My job was to keep this one honest. The rain stopped. The river kept its appointment with the dark. I drew the curtains and let the room hold its own weather. My last thought before sleep rose gently and did not clench. I turned off the light. The photograph is beautiful. The night was real. The wound has finished its work. I am home. Morning poured into the room in slow gold, touching the brass plate on the wall before it reached my face. I woke without the startle that used to follow me, without that reflex of bracing for loss. The air felt balanced. I brewed coffee and carried the mug to the armchair, the steam curling in shapes, too delicate to name. The album still sat on the table, open to the rainy night photograph. I let my gaze rest there, not because I needed to revisit it, but because I could. The sentence from that evening came back with a tone stripped of all weaponry. Home is where love stays. Michael had believed it then, and in his own way, I think he still wants to believe it now. That belief was never the problem. The problem was forgetting that love does not grant permission to erase the giver. Love stays only when it is respected. I set the mug down and spoke softly to the room, to the river, to the me who had once sat here trembling after the confrontation. If love leaves, the home is still mine. The words settled in the air like a second foundation. They did not argue with the first sentence. They stood beside it, equal in weight and worth. It struck me how both lines together told the whole truth. One for the seasons when people keep their promises, one for the seasons when they do not. And I realized, with a depth that surprised me, that my strength had grown from holding both truths without breaking. The chair beneath me was a witness to both sentences. It had held me when I believed my son's affection was enough to keep him gentle. It had held me when I realized that gentleness was not the currency he wanted to spend. And now, it held me as I learned how to live with an open door and a guarded heart. I imagined saying both sentences to Michael one day, not as an accusation, but as an offering. Perhaps we would be standing by this very window, watching the Hudson fold into itself. I would remind him of his own words from that rainy night, and then give him mine in return. Not to win, not to score a point, but to complete the lesson neither of us knew we were beginning back then. The river outside was restless, but certain, its currents weaving under the surface. I felt a kinship with it. From the street, it looks like a single body moving in one direction. From above, you can see the cross-currents, the eddies, the small circles of water returning briefly to where they started before moving on. My life felt like that now. Still flowing forward, but with moments that looped back to honor what came before. Frank stopped by with the morning paper. He lingered at the door while I poured him coffee. He glanced at the album and smiled, not asking, but knowing I had found a way to live with it open. Over coffee, he said something I will keep for as long as I live. A house is walls and roof. A home is what you say to yourself when you wake up there. When he left, I stood at the threshold and repeated it under my breath. I thought of all the mornings I had woken in fear or guilt, rehearsing explanations or apologies before my feet even touched the floor. Now, the first words I heard belonged to me, and they were enough to build on. Later that day, I sat on the balcony with a notebook. I wrote the 2 sentences at the top of a clean page. Home is where love stays. If love leaves, the home is still mine. I left space under them, a place to add whatever life might teach me next. Then I closed the notebook and let it rest on my lap while I watched the river trade its silver for blue. I thought of the people who might hear this story, not just the details of what was taken and what was given back, but the arc of it. The way a woman who had been the quiet center of a family learned to be the quiet center of herself. I hoped they would hear the steadiness in the ending. I hoped they would take their own sentences and keep them safe. The day stretched long and calm. I cooked a simple dinner, letting the smells fill the apartment until it felt lived in again. After the dishes were washed and the lamps turned low, I walked the rooms once more. Each object seemed to nod at me, as if to say, "Yes, we are still here. Yes, this is still yours." Before bed, I stood in the center of the living room, between the chair and the balcony, and spoke both sentences again. Not for Michael, not for anyone else, but for the walls, the floor, and the woman who had reclaimed them. Home is where love stays. If love leaves, the home is still mine. The echo in the room was soft, almost tender. I turned out the lights and let that echo be the last thing I carried with me into sleep. It was enough. It was everything. The afternoon light leans warm across the balcony. It paints the brass plate by the door and lays gold along the arm of my chair. The Hudson carries a steady wind that smells faintly of rain and metal. It lifts the edge of the white runner on my table and turns the steam above my cup into a ribbon. I sit with the cup in my hands and listen. The kettle has finished its song. The apartment has returned to its natural key. Everything feels measured, held, and honest. I step outside and let the breeze touch my face. Below me, the city arranges itself for evening. Ferries draw white stitches across the water. Sirens pass without insistence. Bicycles ring bells that sound like reminders rather than demands. I rest my palm on the rail and name what is here. Chair, river, light, my breath. The order matters because I matter. This is the life I rebuilt quietly and on purpose. There is a question I want to ask while the wind is kind and the light is good. Have you ever had to choose between keeping someone and keeping yourself? Did you stand at a door that kept taking, or did you close it and learn to live with the echo? Tell me in the comments. Stories make a map. We are less alone when we can point to a line and say, that is where I stood. The wind moves through the balcony garden and sets the rosemary nodding. I think of Michael and send a wish his way that does not borrow anything from my future. I think of Emily's parents and hope their windows find generous light. I think of all the women who wrote me letters in their heads while I spoke and did not know where to send them. I will make a place for those letters. I will keep a chair for those names. If you are listening and you need that chair, consider this an invitation. There is one last thing I want to say clearly while the sun still rests on the water. Home is where love stays. If love leaves, the home is still mine. The sentences stand side by side. They do not argue. They teach. I did not arrive at them quickly. I took the long way with careful steps and a few wrong turns. If you are on that road, let the small signs comfort you. A cup that you wash and set to dry, a plant that greets you when you open the balcony door, a breath that arrives on time. These are not decorations. They are mile markers for returning. Frank would say that houses are built from materials and homes are built from language. I believe him. Every time I wake here and greet the room with words that belong to me, the walls learn my voice. Every time I refuse to trade my safety for someone else's convenience, the floor grows steadier under my feet. Every time I bless another household without sacrificing my own, the windows hold a clearer view. I set the cup down and listen for the smallest sounds, the faint clink of porcelain as the spoon touches the rim, the hush of the wind as it changes its mind, the soft step of a neighbor in the hall. These are the closing credits of an ordinary day. I do not rush them. I let them guide me to the ending that feels earned. If you are watching with someone you trust, take their hand for a moment and let the silence between you speak. If you are watching alone, know that alone is not the same as abandoned. There are people standing with you in quiet rooms, across rivers and countries and time zones. Some are just beginning to draw their lines. Some are resting after the hardest chapter. Some are lifting a cup to their mouth and tasting relief for the first time in years. Before we say goodbye, we would love to know where you are watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every one with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, carry this story kindly and let it breathe. When you share your story, be gentle with your own name. We are learning as we go. We are doing the math of mercy in pencil. We are allowed to erase and try again. I will be here, on this balcony when the afternoon tilts toward evening, ready to listen. The sun lowers another inch. The river gathers more blue than gold. The breeze cools and carries the smell of bread from a bakery 2 blocks over. I will light a lamp soon and close the door to keep the night honest. For now, I will ask you once more, have you ever had to choose between keeping someone and keeping yourself? Tell me where you are in that story. Tell me what sentence is helping you stand. Tell me what you are ready to carry into tomorrow. May gentleness meet you at the door you choose to guard today. Sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and we will see you in the next story. I lift the cup one last time. The spoon makes a small silver sound against the china. The screen can turn dark now. The wind will keep speaking. The river will keep its word. Good night, wherever you are. Be safe, be steady, and keep your key.